process view of supply chain. In that, we are interested in looking at process strategy, what exactly process strategy means. Within that, we will look at process structure, customer involvement, capital intensity, and process focus. So these are things which are part of the process strategy that companies have to do. And for each of them, we have to have certain plan for how the process should be structured, how customers should be involved or patients should be involved in the healthcare context. Many times we also mean internal customers. So between two departments, there is handoff, and one department acts as a supplier, the other acts as an internal customer. So how much involvement within the organization should be there for these customers? How much capital intensity might be the right way to proceed for a given service? And then aspects like, how do we focus our processes? Is it really right to actually process have a focused process, or should we have several different kinds of processes under the same, large, for example, healthcare organization? Which strategy is better? And then how do we plan for changes within the processes? What kind of improvement plans we can have? How can we re-engineer the process? So some of those aspects will be covered as part of this week. So starting with supply chain management at the very basic level, this is essentially synchronization of a firm's processes with those of its suppliers' processes and customers. And the reason why we want to synchronize these processes is so that we can match the flow of materials that is coming from the supplier all the way till the customer, the flow of services that might be, again, coming all the way from upstream supplier all the way downstream to the customer, as well as information. And all this synchronization has to happen in light of what the customer demand is. So if the demand peaks up, then the flow has to reflect that demand increase. And as we see at this point in time, because of the COVID-19, we do have a big surge in patient demand for a certain kind of requirement of surgical supplies, for medical supplies, for testing capacity, for services that are needed. And all these need to be planned after we have a situation like this where we are reacting to a certain extent. So the idea of risk management sometimes also will be part of this supply chain synchronization process, because sometimes you're reacting, sometimes you're proactive about what exactly the situation was. So that's the essence of supply chain. And when we deal with these processes and synchronization of processes, we now have to go a little bit more into the details of what it entails when we are managing these processes. What are the types of things that we will be managing as part of this process? So to do that, we need to first define a process. So a process is any activity or group of activities that would take some inputs, it'll transform them, and then provide some outputs for its customers. And as I was saying earlier, these customers could be internal customers, or it could be an external customer for whom the process is generating some sort of an output. So from a supply chain point of view now, all these processes, when we put them together in a series, that would be what we will be managing. And the end goal will be that these services, these processes that we are working on for the service or the product should be providing the product at the level of satisfaction that the customer is expecting. So that's the sort of metric that companies have to work towards when they are working on synchronizing these processes. So there are three focal areas I just mentioned earlier also, that operations will be the core of our discussion this week, next week, when we are talking about process analysis, capacity management, even lean systems. And then later on, we will also look at sourcing and logistics, where we will get to understanding what is supplier development, how do we select suppliers, how do we evaluate suppliers. And in healthcare, we obviously have the GPOs and how those other organizations play a role in the sourcing activity. And those create nuances which are different from what we might see in other industries. So that's something which we will discuss there. And logistics is finally where the movement of goods, as in the form of transportation or warehousing, packaging, all those things which eventually will be necessary for the supply chain to operate. So the three focal areas, and within that, our key focus for some time will be on operations to begin with, and then moving on to sourcing and logistics. All right, so now when we are looking at these processes and we know it's essentially an activity or group of activities, one of the most important thing that we do within this process management is process analysis. In other words, a way in which we can document and understand in detail what that process is all about becomes a keystone for any organization to improve the processes. So this is something which you will see being referred in different ways. You would see Six Sigma process improvement models. You might have heard the term Six Sigma, where organizations are involved in improving their quality by following certain process improvement steps, defining a process, measuring the required things that they want to improve, analyzing it, and then improving it, and then finally controlling the process. So here, really our goal is to look at this analysis part of whether it's a Six Sigma model or any other model. And when we are doing this, one of the important thing we do is qualitatively document and evaluate the process through flowcharts, through process charts. We can create different kinds of pictorial representation of the process, and those eventually help an organization to communicate among all the stakeholders what's going on and what needs to be improved. So that's one thing I think becomes an important starting point for most of the companies. So at this stage, I'll just open it up for discussion, just to get a sense of how you might have experienced either being part of process analysis or others doing process analysis within your company. So just to open it up for discussion. Any experiences with process analysis within your companies?
I can provide one in my past organization as well as the current one. A lot of the work that we have taken on is improve access for patients. So it's a series of events that really start to what is the front door, if you will, to the organization. Click, call, or come in sort of approach, and then it starts at that point to making sure that it's what is easy routes for patients versus what is not. How do we improve also when they arrive, the ability to quickly process them and get them into the system. It's one thing when you're talking about patients that come in through emergency room and need emergency care.
Yeah.
We initiate the care in parallel to registering them. But when you think about all other patients, whether it's diagnostic tests or needing surgery, things that are scheduled and planned, how do we make it easier for that flow? So we've spent a lot of time in understanding, what the patient needs and the timing in which they need it, and how do we help facilitate that? Because turnaround time on just letting patients know, for example, when their when their surgery is going to be scheduled, they don't want to wait 2 or 3 weeks when they know they need to have surgery, even if it's not emergent, because they want to start planning their life. So how do we do that and be able to fulfill that, if you will, fulfill that order?
So what technique did you use for process analysis when you were doing this?
Well, we use the lean methodology to be able to walk through the process. And then there's a lot of, tools or analysis, whether it's checklists, whether it's turnaround time, a lot of other, additives that come in with each step to say, is it wasted time or is it added value time? And then what do you need to do to not only get rid of the wasted time or the time waiting, but what is it that you do to make sure the actual action steps are the highly valuable action steps? So it's kind of like you don't have two people to go out and check your mail. One person goes and checks the mail and gets all the mail, as opposed to I go get one piece, my wife goes gets one piece, and my daughter go gets the other piece of mail. Right. So it's really looking at those internal processes within the overall processes to make sure that it's the most value added steps.
Right, right. So you're really referring to value stream mapping, sort of a tool that you might have used, which distinguishes wastage versus value added activities, and something which we will discuss in lean systems. And you also mentioned checklists. So that's what we are discussing at this point. So when we are talking about process analysis at the very basic level, we would do something like checklist just to understand the frequency of some sort of error that continues to happen, or the frequency of things that needs attention. If we just can create some sort of a Pareto understanding that there are these 20% of activities that are causing 80% of the headache. And just to distinguish those 20%, these process analysis tools end up being very handy. And at this stage, I think those kinds of tools will be part of our discussion. And then later on, value stream mapping really expands on it, end to end, looking at all the processes and then understanding where waste might be occurring. So the tools that we have for process analysis, as I was saying earlier, process charts, flow charts, they start becoming more systematic. For example, there is one called Swimlane Flowchart. Uh, what this does is it essentially distinguishes across departments how exactly things are happening. So, for example, certain activities might be happening within the sales department, or certain activities might be happening in the operations department. So, by distinguishing across these departments, we know how many handoffs happen across departments. And in healthcare, we know that there is this continuum of care, and therefore there is quite a bit of handoff that happens between different clinical specialties. And each of these handoffs are opportunities for improvement many times. And just to visually see how that is happening, where an action is taken, where a decision has to be taken, is what Swimlane Flowchart, for example, tries to do. And the other one is process charts, which essentially organizes everything that is happening and categorizes them into set of things that can be called operation, where something has been transformed from input by doing certain things to some kind of an output with some value addition. There are some activities we will categorize as transportation, which is the movement of supplies or anything that might be required for healthcare. Inspection would be another activity. Delay, waiting, for example, would be one example of a delay, or storage. So there's an example that I have in the video where we go through this process of the emergency department and the patient checking in. And that whole process has been mapped in the form of a process chart. And each activity has been categorized into either operation, transportation, inspection, delay, or storage. And then we can determine what fraction of time is spent in what category of these activities, so that we can really focus on that. So that's the objective of these process charts. And they also are useful to really create a cost estimate of that process. You can really understand the annual cost for an entire process by just looking at the time it takes to perform the process, what's the variable cost, and the number of times that process is performed every year. So that's the way typically your labor cost can be determined. And in healthcare, labor cost is a big component, so it becomes useful to really get that estimation in place. Right, so this is a sort of checklist, is what Doug, you had mentioned, but likewise you can use histograms, Pareto charts, scatter diagrams, and cause and effect. Cause and effect diagram is an example that we have here. Again, an illustration of something which is provided in the video. So I'm not going in detail on every single thing that we have here, because much of it is in the videos. I just wanted to kind of go over the overview of the content we have there, so that we know that we are at this point discussing at a stage where we are really looking at processes, and then we build on it in the subsequent weeks. So this cause and effect diagram, also called fishbone diagram, essentially is looking at a certain focal problem that we are trying to solve. So in this case, for example, it's post-surgical delirium. And that becomes sort of in the fishbone diagram, this head of the fish, or cause effect diagram, the real main area that we're trying to focus on. And all these different factors are contributing to it. So they become the bone in the fishbone diagram. So we are looking at staff related issues that could be causing post-surgical delirium, the environment itself, patients could be causing it sometimes, and what are the processes that might be contributing to it. So this also is very useful once we have categorized them into these different types of causes. Then we can work on them and decide how we can proceed from there. So those are sort of process analysis tools, very important to get that qualitative understanding of the process. Once we have taken stock of the process through these kinds of tools, then we determine, okay, the process is of a certain type where we might have to change it or we might have to improve it. So we step somewhat at a higher level to understand what exactly is the process strategy that we are trying to execute here. What pattern of decisions are being made to manage these processes? What is our competitive priority? And is it being achieved the way our processes are currently running? And that's a question which is asked as part of the process strategy question. And there are four main decisions that we take as part of process strategy. One is the structure of the process. So what is the way we want to have the layout? What is the way we would like to ensure that the customization levels or the level of divergence in our processes that might be required is in place? Or if we want to have everything in a linear flow, how much of that needs to be there in the structure of the process? So that's the first sort of decision we take. Then we decide the level of customer involvement. For certain activities, you want high levels of involvement of the customer because it helps understand the need. But in certain kinds of activities, you want to limit that because it can also be disruptive. So there is a balance, and it will be dictated by what the real competitive priority of that process is, how much involvement should be there. Then comes resource flexibility, a flexible resource versus a more dedicated resource. How much is that necessary to achieve what is needed from the process? And finally, your capital intensity. So these are like four decisions, again, elaborated further in the video. We now see capital intensity in the form of robots that are doing certain things in healthcare. And there's a decision that has to be made about the investment on, let's say, robots, as in what the objective of that robot is and how much it's fulfilling the need that you have, the competitive priority that you have. So that's where this decision pattern comes into flow, into picture here, that if the emphasis is on top quality and customization, we have this customer contact matrix that has been discussed in video, where you distinguish your process structure into front office, hybrid office, and back office. The front office is the one where there's high level of customization, and you are trying to achieve higher quality as part of your competitive priority. So this is the customer facing, patient facing activities, right from the check-in process of the patient to the time you're taking the patient to the triage and all those things. So there is quite a bit of engagement of the patient, and those are all front office, which would have implications on the way you will structure the process, how much involvement will be there, how much flexibility you can have for the resources, and then how much intensive your capital will be there. And if the objective is more of low cost, on-time delivery, that's when you are structuring the process more like a back office, more like an accounting, payroll processing, or any of those kinds of things you could be doing with less of customer involvement, a process structure which is much more straightforward. So those implications will basically connect with how you have decided the overall emphasis of your service processes. So those are the decisions that you take in process strategy. Then we come to this discussion of how do we focus our process segments. We have healthcare organizations that have focused on a specific care, and there are healthcare organizations that have several different specialties that they're offering. And the question is, which one is the right strategy? Because one of these organizations is focusing on economies of scale in the sense of across different departments, whereas the others are focusing on just having one specific care delivery, but within that they want to gain as much of economies. So there is this sort of a trade-off between having diverse portfolio of services versus having one single service. So there are several concepts coming from mostly automotive industry, which now is getting a lot of traction in healthcare. For example, this idea of plant within plants, where you will have a very large healthcare organization offering different kinds of specializations, but you would then create these smaller segments within that organization where these are having their own individualized competitive priorities. They will have their own process structure and set of workforce that is suited for that particular specialty, and they'll have their own objectives which they will fulfill. So this plant within plants is something which comes from automotive but now has been used in healthcare organizations as well. Likewise, you have concepts like what you see in retail organizations, where you go to a large retailer and you will see one area where you will get Levi's jeans, the other place where you will get more upmarket brand having its own layout, a sort of decor and color scheme and music and everything. So essentially within very large retail store, you will have these smaller, more accessible spaces that are catering to a specific brand image that that particular brand creates. Same idea is also now observed in healthcare, similar to what we were just discussing earlier with regards to plant within plants, but this is more of focused service operations under one large umbrella organization. So once again, I'd like to see if some comments on this, as in your reflection on ideas on plant within plant or focused service operations, what your experience has been, how your organization is structured at this point in time. Anyone? So how many of you are right now in an organization where it's a multi-speciality hospital where you might be having these different specialties having their own competitive priorities, the way they are structured and the processes that are organized in a certain way which is different from the other specialty?
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. I work in supply chain. I'm a supply chain supervisor for the cardiac procedures unit at Michigan Medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So our entire floor is based on what our floor's needs are, in comparison to the OR that's upstairs. They have different inventory. We have a warehouse down in B2 that is available for the entire hospital. And
Mm-hmm.
we have our offsite distributor that distributes, but it's very segmented and broken down that way.
Okay, so your inventories are also assigned based on a specialty. Are there some of the specialties that share the inventories as well?
Yes.
And which ones are these?
Well, just on a basis of being the cardiac procedures unit, our inventory is set up to where we use QSite, which is a program through Owens and Minor online. We do point of use through that.
Mm-hmm.
So the inventory has to be in the system, but it's broken down between the cath lab an EP lab.
Right.
So if something is going to be used in the cath lab, but it's in inventory at the EP lab, we have to transfer it over.
Mm-hmm.
But then within the cath lab, we also have a hybrid OR on
Mm-hmm.
our floor that does cath lab cases, IR cases, and OR cases.
Mm-hmm.
So there's inventory that'll be in the cath lab, but the OR or IR will use it. So we have to track that and figure out if they used it from our floor, if they brought it from upstairs,
Mm-hmm.
and then we do TAVRs in there, which involves the OR and cath lab physicians. So it can get very complicated.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. So you have seen this in action. Actually, the focus by these different kinds of um, tasks that you just mentioned.
Yep, very much so.
Any other perspective from someone else? Where the organization just does one thing and that's it. There's nothing beyond that. There's no need for multiple process segments to be created. Is there an example of that? Today, with many of these decentralized healthcare delivery systems that are in place, whether you have these retail clinics, urgent care centers, it has a structure which does not necessarily require a focus by different process segments. It's a little different than a large healthcare organization, and a very different kind of focus is needed there as against the way we just mentioned here for much larger economies of scale that others have to achieve. So diverse set of processes with different kinds of approaches taken by these organizations. It's important to kind of keep in mind the context within which it's applied. So that's the key idea that we have here. And beyond that, the videos talk about how we change the process through either reengineering, which means we're radically changing the entire process because you realize that what has been done right now is not really providing the competitive advantage or is not fulfilling the needs of the customer. So you need to re-engineer it. The other way that companies go about changing the process is through continuous process improvement. It's more likely that most of the organizations do continuous process improvement. And there you are taking incremental steps to make changes. And again, some discussion on that you'll see in the videos. So with that, I think we have discussed the content, but now I'd like to get into the articles, the 4 required articles, just to illustrate the importance of supply chain and where we're going with it. The idea here for the first week is to put this big picture of supply chain and how it is contributing towards many of the things that are needed for healthcare as a sector. For example, cost reduction or improving access. So the first article here is supply chain the cure for rising healthcare costs? And what it does is it highlights the context of healthcare industry and emphasizes the fragmentation in it and also the regionalization in it. So unlike, for example, grocery industry, where quite a bit of supply chain transformation happened in 1980s, 90s, this industry, the healthcare industry, does not lend itself that straightforward because of the nature it has in the fragmentation and regionalization. So therefore, some unique strategies are needed, unique way of managing processes are needed to handle the challenges we have in healthcare, especially in the supply chain side. We have pricing models that are indexed to inflation, that typically have not created an incentive for most of the organizations to collaborate with each other. So we don't have too much of collaboration between the drug manufacturer to, let's say, the wholesaler or the company which is doing the warehousing to the company which is providing the healthcare delivery. So quite a bit of that aspect of collaboration, which at this point in other industries is more or less sort of given because of the incentive structure that has been set up, is currently not necessarily there in healthcare. And then technological sophistication have recently started becoming the norm in the industry. With Amazon entering this industry, I think it's going to become it's going to expand in leaps and bounds. But until very recently, the technological sophistication has not yet reached what we will see in other industries. So these are unique context of the industry, which presents both challenges and opportunities for supply chain to really contribute. So what this article then does is it takes the total expenditure on healthcare, national healthcare expenditure from 2009 to 2016, and then looks at how much of that approximately would be hospital care. And then from there, 25% of it, based on several statistics that have been out there, on average, about 25% of the spend is from supply chain related costs. It comes up with an estimate of approximately what the costs were in 2009 and what would it be in 2016 if the current projection at the time when the article was written, 2016-15 time period, which is 6.2% rise of these costs. If they continue, then there will be a certain cost, which is $300 billion, which we see up there. And there is this opportunity to reduce that growth of cost from 6.2% to 5.2%, a 1% reduction on an annual basis. And if we are able to achieve that through different possibilities, which we'll talk about in the next slide, then we can bring down the total cost by $281 billion, about $19 billion of saving here. And if we can achieve 2% reduction in this cost, then another 19 billion, so $37 billion overall is what we are seeing as the savings. So that's the savings. That is what this article is emphasizing, which is possible through just utilizing some of these supply chain tools that have been well documented and used quite effectively in other industry. And from that 19 billion with a 1% reduction in cost, or 37 billion with a 2% reduction in cost, it then extrapolates it to what would be the total expenditure if we were to account for the overall healthcare savings that we will get from supply chain. So it's about 60 billion or 118 billion, depending on how much saving has been achieved, 1% or 2%. So substantial saving possibilities. And the idea here is to really eliminate two main causes of this cost increase. One is the redundancy, and the other is complexity. And the article emphasizes that there are redundant warehouse assets that exist in healthcare. There is excess inventory, which leads to many times losses, write-offs. So that's again redundancy, another form of redundancy. The complexity could be in the form of mismatched demand and supply locations, and expedited shipping that is needed, poor service that is offered many times when that mismatch exists. So that's something which can be remedied by reducing the complexity of how interactions are happening. And then there is this complexity of several SKUs that you have to carry. You have to carry general items, physician preference items, and then there can be error when things are changing in terms of the requirements because of either the demand or within the healthcare provider, somebody deciding to choose a different supply. All that increases cost. They can also result in poor service. So these are kinds of areas where there are opportunities to eliminate cost through elimination of redundancy and reducing these complexities. And then the article emphasizes how other industries have been able to help reduce many of these costs by means of trust and collaboration. Right now, we discussed earlier that that's currently not easy to establish because of very divergent incentive structures among different players in the healthcare industry, but similar things were true for other industries also. So electronics, automotive industry, consumer goods industry, they have achieved reduction in inventories, for example, or savings in inventory related savings, administration related savings, substantial amount through collaboration, through trust. So that's something which again is slowly becoming more common. Some of my experiences with companies have shown that there is a lot more of collaborative exchanges, collaborative initiatives that are happening between, let's say, 3PL and healthcare delivery company. And those are eventually going to help with many of the cost that can be contained through it. The other way in which you can reduce cost is by aligning goals and incentives. One of the reasons why collaboration does not come through is because of this misalignment of goals and incentives, and improving information transparency. So there is a good best practices segment within the article of Leahy Clinic, which emphasizes three different aspects that they have engaged in. Number one, they have replaced their current inventory system with a stockless inventory system. And that basically makes sure that the inventories are only brought into the clinic as and when needed. And that's something which has resulted in cost reduction. The second is they have put in place automated dispensing cabinets, and that helps in controlling the dispensation of medication and medical supplies, which again automates the inventory management and activities and reduces cost. And finally, they have worked very closely with the company Cardinal Health, which then have together implemented this enterprise-wide system, information system, that helps in information transparency. So those are kinds of best practices that are being adopted by many healthcare organizations. So that's the focus of that article. Any personal reflections, experiences from your own work within supply chain or otherwise, with regards to whether creating collaborative relationships or aligning incentives or even information transparencies?
Yeah, I could make a little comment on that. In our recent experience at Michigan Medicine within supply chain, we recently redid our contract with our distributor, Owens & Minor, that should see us save an additional $1 million across the next 5 years. And we also entered into an agreement with some other hospitals. The names of the hospitals escape me right now, but to utilize the same type of PPE and other commodity items to drive down the purchase price across the board for all of us. And then we also utilize stockless inventory, the model that you mentioned, with our commodity items. And then we're also, to take that a step further, my unit is the next one that's going live with a 2-bin inventory system for the stockless commodity items. So that should see us get even more additional savings. But the thing that I've found the hardest is to get, because being a supply chain, we're not clinical, so we don't fully grasp what the items are going to be used for. So getting that clinical knowledge, getting that type of buy-in that they actually want to be involved is something new that we are seeing in our hospitals. So we've actually been able to make a lot of progress on getting stuff off of our shelves, when in the past, a lot of times it was just, we're a level 1 trauma center. I need it when I need it. I don't care if I'm not using it. And now there's a lot more discussion. We can actually, we can sign these contracts that previously we weren't able to do. We can do our RFPs and get savings that previously they didn't want to put in writing.
Yes. Once you are able to show the proof of concept, then there's a lot more buy-in by stakeholders. Yeah, many of this concept like 2-bin inventory system, we will be discussing that as we enter into inventory management discussion, I think in week 3 or so. That's great. So you must have received some tangible, did you quantify the dollar amount saved because of all these efforts?
Yeah, for the entire cardiovascular center, we have a monthly meeting that we basically report out our savings initiatives and what we're doing, looking at incrementally. We've been really strong in the EP lab side because we continue to add items to our reprocessing.
Mm-hmm.
So just in the past month, we saved an additional $60,000 purchasing reprocessed items versus OEM.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, yes, we are
Right. That's great.
any which way possible. We're looking to quantify.
Great. Okay, so this second article, which is again from McKinsey, this one is building new strengths in healthcare supply chain, and it's focused on pharmaceutical companies. So some of you are potentially on the pharmacy side of healthcare system, and this one emphasizes the three key areas of benefit that can be delivered by higher supply chain performance within the pharmaceutical sector. One is the reduced cost, the other is improved access, and third is better patient safety. And what this article does is it emphasizes that pharma companies have been sort of lagging in terms of many of these operational metrics which other industries have done well on. For example, fast moving consumer goods or medical or device organizations, consumer durable companies. If you take inventory days, number of days that you keep the inventory, you notice that fast moving consumer goods have much faster inventory turns. You don't keep inventory for a very long period of time. And the lesser you carry inventory, the more your working capital is, and that's going to be good for the company. So there is this opportunity of 2 to 4x reduction that one can achieve in pharmaceutical companies on inventory days, which in turn results in better working capital, which can then help organizations here do better with that capital. Likewise, obsolescence, percentage of sales, how much is obsolete. Again, a great amount of reduction can be achieved there. And finally, manufacturing lead times are relatively large here compared to what other organizations have seen. So opportunities exist on different operational metrics for improvement. And that's something which this article highlights, that supply chain transformation can actually help in achieving those things. And within pharmaceuticals, the impact on profit as a percentage on the provider side and manufacturer side, how transformation can help everybody in the chain. The pharmaco companies, the device manufacturers, medical device manufacturers, also the hospitals and retail pharmacies. So every organization has certain positive impact on their profit, which can be achieved through supply chain transformation. Some of these organizations gain in the range of 10 to 20%, whereas others slightly more modest, but still positive impact. The idea of patient safety and public health, how supply chain transformation can enable better safety, also has been illustrated with some examples of why sometimes many of these patients face these safety challenges because of supply chain related reasons, whether it's the clinical errors versus medication errors. There's other safety incidents that we have from different countries here. And these are, again, some of these which are preventable by supply chain transformation, by ensuring the information flow is correct. Because as we discussed earlier, supply chain involves not just the flow of material, but also the flow of information, the flow of services. So many of these can be addressed by appropriately addressing supply chain issues there. So this is what the article provides as directions for companies to improve by means of supply chain transformation. They call it internal muscles and external muscles, something that companies should do internally to improve their supply chain. The first one is segmentation, which is to segment the kind of inventories you have, and then focus on how you will manage them based on their characteristics. So you improve service levels and reduce supply chain planning costs by segmentation. One of the examples they mentioned is there could be some inventory or some supplies that you have, or some products that this companies might be having, pharmaceutical companies, that are low volume and high volatility. And then on the other end, you could have some which are high volume and low volatility. These require very different strategy, for example, in terms of their manufacturing frequency. So the article highlights that on one end, you could have production every 8 to 52 weeks for these low volume, high volatility kind of products. On the other end, you could be having production every 2 to 4 weeks for these high volume and low volatility items. So those are ways in which you have segmented and then managing those products with that segmented approach. The second strategy internally is agility, which is to ensure that you're able to adapt to circumstances based on how the demand is shaping and how you can supply based on the demand. The third is the measurement metrics. The right metrics can then help improve the performance. For example, the measure days of on-hand inventories right now in healthcare is way more than the other companies that we see in other industries, and a reduction of substantial amount is possible if we take even that metric of inventory on hand as one thing which we want to improve. So that helps in focusing attention on what to improve. So along with internal, there are some external drivers, and these are alignment, which we just talked about, incentive alignment or alignment in terms of goals between organizations, and collaboration. So those are other ways in which companies can improve their overall costs and access, as well as patient safety dimensions. Some steps for collaboration have been provided. So, I will let you go over the article, but they are mainly focused on ensuring that you have created the right framework and groundwork for the organizations to collaborate, right partners, and then establishing a long-term perspective. So these are some of the improvements that it has highlighted. With supply chain improvement, you can increase revenue, reduce cost, and overall margin improvement because of both top line and bottom line. So essentially, supply chain helps on both sides because of the access that you're providing, lead time reduction and other things. Your revenue is accelerating because you are managing some of the redundancies and costs associated with that. Your costs are improving, and hence overall the margins are improving with those two effects. Right. So the third article which we have here is by this UPS supply chain strategy segment of theirs, and this is by somebody called Paul Dittman from University of Tennessee. What this article does is essentially presents elements of supply chain strategy, and these elements are: look at the customer needs, number one; assess your internal capabilities; understand what the mega trends right now are, regulatory, for example. If there is some changes happening on regulatory front, that's one of the mega trends which will affect all the companies within the industry. So assess those mega trends. Understand the technology landscape, what exists out there and what you're utilizing, the prevailing risk that exists for companies with regards to supply chain, competitive landscape, what others are doing, and how that competition will play out for your organization. And based on those, then you develop new supply chain capabilities. After assessing these 6 aspects, you develop your supply chain capabilities, whether it is investing in collaborative relationships, investing in managing inventories in a certain way, managing capacity in a certain way. Those capabilities then should be followed up with development of your own metrics, create a business case within the organization for top management, as well as clinical practitioners, so that you get the buy-in, and finally you execute. So this is sort of the supply chain strategy that the article emphasizes has helped some companies in managing their supply chain transformation. And this is the fourth article, which is the future of healthcare. This article takes a much higher stance on supply chain, as in looking at not just the healthcare delivery companies, but also looking at the insurers, the service providers, and it's trying to see the profit pool that each of them have at this point in time, how much the insurers are getting affected, how much the delivery providers are getting affected, and then likewise, the service providers are getting affected. So to start with, what it comes up with is an optimistic outlook of healthcare industry in terms of profit pools. It emphasizes that the US healthcare sector's earning before income tax and depreciation has actually increased over the last several years and is estimated to go to $620 to $670 billion. And this increase actually is higher than the top 1,000 US companies. And this is about the profit pools, like the areas where healthcare organization can generate profits if they are managed well. Right? So that's the idea here. And within different segments, what they've done is divided this entire healthcare sector into health insurers, the delivery systems where you have hospitals, physicians, and others, service vendors, and then manufacturers and distributors. And that earning before income tax and the insurance tax and depreciation across these different segments basically have been presented here, where this width of each of these column reflects the percentage of the healthcare industry's total EBITDA, which has been distributed between them. And this height tells us how much each of these individual organizations are able to generate for themselves. So for example, pharmaceutical and biotech have a large proportion of profit within the manufacturer and distributors segment. Within the delivery segment, hospitals currently have the largest in terms of the EBITDA that is apportioned to them. And the width tells us that the delivery system has the largest pool that they work with in terms of profits. So that's the idea that this article has emphasized. And then it elaborates on what are the drivers for the profit pools across these different segments. So insurers, for example, what is causing these profit pools to go up? What are the challenges? So right from commercial lines of business versus the government lines of businesses. You have majority of the profit pool coming from the government lines of businesses because of the increase in the Medicare Advantage enrollments and managed Medicaid plans. Those are increasing quite substantially, and those create these profit pools for these insurers. Then likewise, they've emphasized the role of economies of scale, how much that matters for insurers versus healthcare providers. So essentially, this article is not really about so-called supply chain flow of materials, but more about this idea of managing capacity, managing this scale of operations across different segments, and how that might be necessary for some of these organizations to actually achieve or really attract that profit pool that currently exists.